This is your home for St. Cloud State hockey, keeping you up to date on the NCHC.
One-timer coming, they score! Ripped in! A bomb from Pervix!
Women's WCHA.
So Dana Rasmussen fires and she scores! Dana Rasmussen for the Huskies alongside
The National Hockey League.
Dwayne Kaprizov in for a chance to win it! He scores! Kirill, the thrill is for real! Welcome to the NHL, a game winner!
And everything from the state of hockey.
St. Cloud Cathedral is now 42.6 seconds away from wrapping up the school's first ever title.
Welcome to the Huskies Warming House Podcast Den. And welcome into the Huskies Warming House Podcast, our extension for episode number 158. Nick Max and Noah Grant here on this Sunday evening, getting ready, primed and ready for some playoff action that, of course, starts with our Minnesota Wild tomorrow. We are going to do a deep dive into that first round series against Dallas and then take an overlook into the rest of the NHL playoffs and kind of give our quick predictions for each of those series and who we think our Stanley Cup champion might be. Before we get to that, of course, we'll also know the victors, by the way, of the Women's Worlds. U.S. and Canada doing battle here on Sunday night at 7 o'clock Central Time, so that should be a good one. Canada has had the U.S.'s number as of late, Nick. I don't know that I feel particularly confident as a U.S. fan, but maybe that's what we need to turn the tie, is a lack of confidence.
Probably the opposite. but yeah, it seems like it's been sort of like whoever wins the preliminaries is the one that falls in the medal round, right? Yeah. So it's been kind of a, and this year it was Canada. So maybe that's an omen. I don't know, probably not. But yeah, it seems that Canada, just with their depth, right? I mean, this rivalry has long been, at least on the women's side, the rivalry to watch. And certainly, as you mentioned, Canada has seen to edge the United States, especially when it comes to the medal round contention and taking home the golds versus silvers. So edge still probably lays with Canada, but we'll see what happens, right? Every game's a new game, and see if the USA can knock off the big bad Canadians.
Yeah, it'll be certainly interesting. So keep an eye on that one. You'll have the answer by the time this show comes out, of course, as well as the AHL playoffs. Iowa, Rockford, and Chicago all doing battle here tonight in their final games of the regular season, playing, I believe, Texas, Milwaukee, and Manitoba, respectively. Iowa is playing Texas tonight. Rockford, I believe, is playing Milwaukee, and Chicago is playing Manitoba, if I'm not mistaken. So, and all those games are currently underway, so it will be interesting. Only 2 out of the 3 will make the big dance in the AHL, so keep an eye on that one, of course, as well. But what we're here to talk about, the Minnesota Wild, getting their matchup with Dallas, of course, Colorado taking care of business, exactly how we kind of predicted it, that Colorado, Dallas, and Minnesota would finish in that order. Seattle was not going to make a move, in case you remember last week in my ability to interpret a bracket here. But this is an interesting matchup. According to the actual statistical odds in the sports books, it says that Dallas has a 61% chance to win this matchup compared to 39 for the Minnesota Wild. Most groups don't have this one ending in 4. About a 17% chance Dallas ends it in 5. About even similar numbers, 17-15%, that this goes to 6 games for either team, and then pretty even on the other side that it goes to 7. So for a decision that consensus says Dallas is maybe the better team, and I think Eriksson Ek obviously is going to play a factor for Minnesota in that stat just a little bit. It doesn't really feel like 61%, although this Dallas team has won 6 of its last 9, and they're a pretty scary group that the Wild are going to be heading towards.
Very scary. And again, they, the one thing that Peter DeBoer has done is unlocked whatever happened to Jamie Benn and his offense, right? Whereas, let's put it frank, he was being mocked essentially for him earning that contract with that point production, shall we say, lack thereof the last couple of seasons. It has not been the case this year. Again, Dallas has been riding high. They had a chance to take the first spot in the Central. Colorado had other plans. So the current and defending Stanley Cup champion, Colorado, again facing Seattle, so which is not the Central Division for those who need a secondary note on that. But but this Dallas team, right? Top 6, Pavelski, again, a prime Stanley Cup performer, right? Tyler Seguin, Jamie Benn, and then their depth with Yoel Kiviranta, Radek Faksa, right? They've got players that have been there. Again, mind you, these are the 2020 runner-ups in the Stanley Cup final, losing to the Tampa Bay Lightning. So they've been there recently. And the other thing they have is they've got Jake Ottinger, right? Their goaltending. Dare we say that despite that Minnesota has Philip Gustafsson and Marc-Andre Fleury, Ottinger has been the go-to guy. He was a stud last year in round number 1 against Calgary. In fact, he was probably the only one that showed up for that series. You kind of wonder what Dallas will change or what they've learned from that. Again, under a new head coach, we'll see what they do, but I do think that Dallas does have a slight edge in this. Now, I am curious, Noah, with those odds being set, if they factored in Eriksson Ek being in the lineup or if they were out of the lineup. That's huge to me in terms of how this series goes. I'm wondering if you see the same.
Yeah, interesting. So this article, of course, coming from members of The Athletic, too, and taking a look at kind of the comparison. So as we talk about the forward defense and goaltending comparison here, essentially what they did is they rated both the team and the players at their position types, essentially, and 0 is essentially dead even. So you bring no value or detriment to your team or your unit or whatever it may be. So, for example, Kirill Kaprizov and Jason Robertson are actually exactly comparable. Their offensive rating is +17. Their defensive rating is +3, which means that they bring +20 overall in terms of their team's contributions. The forward comparison, Dallas is at +22 for their forward group, Minnesota at +4. So you can tell that this is a very offensively laden group for Dallas that, like you mentioned, Tyler Seguin, Jamie Benn, guys like that have found their punch, and guys that are kind of middle 6 guys, secondary scoring, Mason Marchment, Max Domi, Wyatt Johnston, Evgeny Dadonov, like you mentioned, and then Joe Pavelski, who's the top line guy, but really has kind of rekindled his fire a little bit. Guys that maybe weren't expected to have, career years or big steps suddenly did for this Dallas team. And they hold the advantage on the forward side, +12 for Dallas compared to +14 for Minnesota on the D side. This is not including Brock Faber. This is including John Merrill, who actually brings a -5 rating overall to this matchup. That could be an X factor that could swing things in a different direction. Brock Faber potentially getting the call for game 1, slotting next to John Klingberg in that matchup. And then netminder-wise, Jake Ottinger a +12. Philip Gustafsson a +9, though. So, I mean, nothing to really scoff at here. As we talk about the team factor, that's where you see the disparity in the goaltenders, especially +47 with Jake Ottinger in net for Dallas compared to +25 with the Fleury Gustafsson combo. Don't be surprised if you see Fleury play at some point, depending on how the series may go.
Defensive, he gets game 1 either.
Yeah, defensively +34 to +31 in favor of the Wild, and then offensively as a team +15 for Dallas compared to -9 for Minnesota. They do not have the advantage compared to production on the offensive side. But that's kind of been Minnesota's MO, right? They are a team that they don't score a lot. They don't score in bunches. The middle part of the season really hurt them in terms of that offensive production because they really struggled. You kind of gave me that look, and I think Wild fans have that thought, in recent weeks, it feels like they've finally been good offensively. But as a whole, over the course of a season, they haven't really offered that, and that's where you see that rating. But that's been Minnesota hockey to a T this year and kind of in years past, besides last year, is that they kind of rely on the defensive game. They're comfortable winning 2-1, 3-2 hockey games. The question is, can Minnesota stop the floodgates that Dallas and I guess Norm Green, in an alternate sense, has brought to the Dallas Stars?
That is the question, right? Because even down the stretch here, granted, even when they were still relatively healthy, there were some defensive lapses with Minnesota's game that gave, me some concern. I think you had some pauses too with watching some film. John Klingberg, oh boy, he's an all or nothing player. We know what he can do when he walks the blue line. It's interesting because here's the thing. If you've got a bad game, the one thing Minnesota has is they have guys like Merrill. They have guys like Goligoski that you can switch in and out if you don't perform well, right? And I'd be curious to see how Minnesota utilizes that extra depth defensively. The other thing I'm curious about is how do the Dallas Stars match up the Boldy Johansson and potentially Sam Steele / Eriksson Ek combo. Because you know that Kaprizov, Zuccarello, and Hartman are going to get a lot of the attention, but with Boldy and Johansson, who I think has been actually a better duo, at least, recently, minus even the injury prones, they've got a 1-2 punch there. But like I said, Minnesota has to really focus defensively. And Brock Faber going from heartbreak to NHL starter, essentially. What an opportunity for him if he does get that call in game one. What confidence from the coaching staff to put a guy, a week removed from his college career into a Stanley Cup playoff game. That shows volumes of his maturity on his game and just the kind of, impression that he's made early on. But again, you kind of wonder if he'll be sheltered a little bit. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. There's a lot of intrigue to this. I know the numbers have a little bit more lopsided, but Noah, I'm sure as you actually really break down the matchups, this is a lot closer than I think people realize.
It is. And even when you talk about the lopsided piece, it actually on the forward side and even Dallas there, it really goes, their top unit is where the bulk of that production of statistic comes from, and then Miro Heiskanen on the back end. The Wild actually have a lot more depth throughout their defensive core. I suppose when you carry 9 defensemen, you're bound to find somebody who can play, right? But beyond that, you mentioned that second line, Matt Boldy, a +10 overall with his offensive and defensive production. You compare that with the entire second line unit on the other side for Dallas, really their actual margin, they're actually a -2. So you think about, the matchup and potentially, especially in games 3 and 4, that Minnesota could bring to the table there, getting last change, creating those opportunities. It'll be an interesting matchup for sure. Like you said, I think the thing with Dallas that is really scary, and this goes back to the other article that Michael Russo put together, is that Dallas is just consistent overall. You look goals against per game, third in the league compared to 6th for Minnesota, and their goals for per game is 7th in the National Hockey League compared to 23rd for Minnesota. This Stars team produces and they limit chances. Top 5 essentially in the NHL in special teams, number 1 in faceoff percentage, top 10 in shots against, and top 15 in shots for. So this Dallas team brings a lot of scariness, and the Wild are in the second half of the league in a lot of those statistics. Again, that's over the course of the season. It doesn't really mean a whole lot during playoff time. Just ask the 2019 Tampa Bay Lightning.
Right.
But really, as we kind of get out of the nuts and bolts of what the matchup really is going to entail, you kind of look at the eye candy test a little bit, and you see what this group has got here. I think if the Wild can counteract the loss of Eriksson Ek, who sounds like he might actually be a lot closer than we think. Joe Smith talked about something. He released something about 6 hours ago and said that he skated for about 45 minutes after practice today on Sunday, and also mentioned that the doctors essentially cleared him in a sense that they said, when you feel ready, when you feel 100%, you're ready. And I think that's a vote of confidence to say that it's kind of on the player to see where he is feeling at that point. It's not a medical decision that's keeping him out. It's how do you feel with his injury? And as soon as Eriksson Ek feels up to it, we might see him. I don't think we'll see him in games 1 or 2.
No.
But the initial projection was that we wouldn't see him until maybe game 6 or 7. I think there's a chance we could see him on the XL ice in game 3 or game 4.
I think you're right on that. And I think, despite the medical side of it, right, Noah, is that if you're the Minnesota Wild, right, you want to make sure you're not putting him out there in a sense where, and granted, we don't know the severity of what happened. I mean, we all saw the film, so there's an inkling of what we think happened, right? I think the worst thing you can do is trot him out for game 1 in Dallas, and all of a sudden he's out for the rest of whether it's the series or the playoffs, right? So, and I know Eriksson Ek is dying to get out there. We know he's a gamer, he's a competitor, but you have to be a little bit protective, I think, of Eriksson Ek, because if you're able to split in Dallas, worst case scenario, right? Or if you go down 2-0, I'd rather have a full healthy, or at least a healthier version of Eriksson Ek for games 3 and 4 at home. Like you said, when you have last change, when he can be slotted in between Boldy and Johansson and really make a big impact. So I don't know, we'll see. But I do think there's a little bit of, shall we say, media gamesmanship that's happening there too, Noah. That happens. But you talk about matchups. I'm curious as to your thoughts on the Reeves, Duhaime, and Dewar line and how important they are going to be in terms of not just what they bring, but how they can essentially try to slow down that either first or second line, because I mean, I know everybody wants Reeves to get goals. Everybody wants Duhaime. That's not going to be their role in the playoffs. They're there to be a shutdown line. And when we say shutdown, Noah, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, well, I think, just limiting chances and keeping things to the perimeter. There's no way you're going to keep Pavelski, Rupe Hintz, and Jason Robertson from not getting pucks on net and not getting opportunities. They're just that good. But at the same time, can you limit their chances in the middle of the ice in the danger areas? Can you keep plays to the outside, and can you make plays one and dones where if it is a good opportunity, you're corralling rebounds, you're not allowing rebounds, you're not allowing second chance opportunities. And that's going to be important. You really think of a guy, especially like Ryan Reeves, who we'll see what the longevity for him in this series is going to be just with his foot speed. Not that, for a big guy, he actually doesn't move terribly. I think people have this idea that he's slow. He's in his mid 30s, but at the same time, he still actually moves all right for a big guy. It's just, can he contend with these guys who are very fleet of foot? Mason Marchment, another one on that second line that, brings the offense for the Dallas side. But it'll be interesting. You look at Dewar, of course, who, obviously brings that defensive shutdown play, good speed, the opposite direction, essentially mitigating chances, alleviating pressure. They're, like you said, they're not out there to score goals. They're not out there to generate offense. If they do, it's a plus. It's a good spark plug if they can do that. But really keeping the play outside of the defensive zone and trying to keep the play across center ice, essentially, that's the goal for that unit. And if they can establish some zone time, that'll obviously alleviate some pressure too. But if this especially becomes a special teams battle, they're going to be important too, not only with Dewar on the PK side, but just in general, because you see those bottom six units that will get rolled out, especially after certain power plays or penalty kills as well too. It's going to be important. That's what the playoffs are. The star matchups, the top lines always match up and cancel each other out. The heroes are born in the middle six, the bottom six of the lineup. That's where this series is going to be won and lost. And really, can Minnesota exploit beyond the first pairing for Dallas? Ryan Suter's track record isn't the greatest in playoffs, and now he's on the other side of things, so you can't really complain about that either. It's interesting. Let's just go this way here, Nick. Straight to it. Minnesota-Dallas, how many games? Who gets it done, and why?
Oh, boy. Oh, geez. I'm going to go bold. Minnesota in 6.
I said the exact same thing.
And here's why I say that. And maybe we're telepathically aligned, which normally is never, ever.
Or we just bought into Minnesota sports fandom for the 27,000th time.
No, but I do think that there's something that's different with this team. Last year, we saw that this team could light things up, right? I still think they have the ability to do that. And the other thing they learned this year is, okay, well, I was at the opener. When it was essentially a gunslinger race, they didn't win that battle, right? But they still potted, I think, 4 or 5 goals and it lost to the Rangers. So they tweaked some things. They became more defensively sound, and they started to win those tighter hockey games, and more so not having to do it by coming from behind, right? That was something that last year, it seemed magical, but it was not sustainable. It's not a playoff winning formula. Whereas this year, I felt like they're just a little bit more in control, right? Where I feel like, it's a bit more of a smarter, more a playoff brand of hockey. And the one thing that, no matter what all these statistics know, what all of the forwards versus D versus goalie, that doesn't really matter over the course of a 7-game series. What matters is what do the adjustments happen? So if it does become a defensive battle, Minnesota can open things up. And I do feel confident, especially with the emergence of Boldy the last month or so, that they can attack here on there. I do think that they can match up offensively. Kaprizov being back helps. If they get Eriksson Ek back at some point, he's going to be an infusion of both sides of the ice. He's a 200-foot player that, geez, how irreplaceable has he become? My goodness. And then again, Freddie Gaudreau, right, who just signed that extension. I think he's invaluable too here. And with Minnesota's decor, I think they're more balanced. They maybe don't have the star power like with Miro Heiskanen down with Dallas, but I think they've got more depth and I think they're more sound there. I think the bigger question is outside of Jake Ottinger for Dallas, right? Is he going to get onslaughted? Is there going to be, essentially with Calgary, they just packed the middle of the ice in front of him. They just took his vision away. And with any goaltender, I don't care who you are, ask Marty Brodeur and Sean Avery. I'm sure they'll tell you a pretty nice story about that. Ask any goaltender and they'll tell you if there's chaos in front of me, it makes my job that much harder. And I think with the fourth line, and I think this is where the X factor comes in with Reeves, Dewar, and Duhaime, they have a knack to not only get on the forecheck, they can finish bodies, but they can get puck possession, and they do have a knack to create some offense out of that. And with Reeves, who has been good at getting to the front of the net and creating chaos, he's a guy that essentially is built for this type of moment. If he can do that and just be there and piss off the opponent, I give the edge to Minnesota here.
It's interesting. Of course, I think it comes down to goaltending. It really does. Mm-hmm. And Minnesota, for the first time in quite a while, can say that they've got at least a goaltender, if not both, who can probably have a chance to carry them into the second round in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. The only problem is, I would say Jake Ottinger, Connor Hellebuck in Winnipeg, and Linus Ullmark in Boston would probably be the three netminders that have the edge over the Gustis and Fleury tandem. But other than that, Minnesota is in a good spot goaltending wise. They've got to find a way to solve this first round opponent. I think if they do that, they're going to put themselves in a really good spot here. Like you mentioned, I think we both had them in 6 games. And, Minnesota, you got to have one on the road. You have to have one in the first 2 for sure, and try to put yourself in a spot where you can win it on home ice in game number 6. If you're in game 6 fighting for your playoff life, it's not the worst thing in the world, but if you can go into that where you carry a 3-2 lead into that game, things just change monumentally in your favor for that opportunity. The XL is a dangerous place to play if you're the road team in an environment like that. So Minnesota in 6, I totally agree. The winner of that matchup, of course, just a very quick little glance as we finish out the very abbreviated show that we have for you this week. The Avalanche in Seattle, which Seattle, a very good defensive team, their first playoff berth in franchise history in their second season. This one's interesting too. Just very quickly, who do you think comes out of this one and how many games?
I still think Colorado, but that loss of Landeskog is going to hurt them a bit. It's not going to be as one-sided as I think people thought it was going to be, because with Landeskog in there, we know what he brings, right? With that leadership, he's a 200-foot player. He's got the knack to find the back of the net and, be the stand-up guy. He's a guy that you want on your side of the bench. But here's the thing with Colorado, right? I still think goaltending is a bit of a question mark for him. Yeah. I really do. But on the flip side of it for Seattle, the franchise, first time they've been in the playoffs. Here's the thing, though. They have had players that have had playoff experience. Now, the thing is with Hackstall and the system that he runs is how can he slow down the guys like McKinnon or Rantanen, Nichushkin, right? Cale Makar. I think that's going to be the focus for them is how do you try to limit their chances, because you can eliminate them. There's just no way they're that good. But I still think Colorado, over the course of a series, over 7 games, maybe 4 or 5, I think they have the edge, and I think they have the weapons to overcome a stout Seattle defense, which I think the big thing is, Matty Beniers, he's emerged as a good offensive weapon. Oliver Bjorkstrand, we know Jordan Eberle's been there. He has experience. I just don't think they just have enough in the tank offensively to be able to respond to what Colorado can always bring every time they hit the ice. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I had Colorado in 7 in this one. I think this one's, this might be akin to the Wild series back in 2014, where this one goes to overtime in game 7. I think that the defensive structure of Seattle, a lot of people sleep on that. And the fact is, without Landeskog especially, can Colorado overcome that by bringing their offensive punch to the table? Can they get secondary scoring guys like Evan Rodriguez, for example, that can bring that ability in the secondary? That'll be, I think, the key for Colorado. I think they still get over the hump because you look at Seattle. I mean, they've got guys like Jared McCann, obviously, but I don't think they have enough depth at either position where they're going to overwhelm Colorado despite the goaltending matchup. But it's going to kind of be tooth and nail here. I think Colorado does get Minnesota in the second round. That's an interesting one, Nick. I'm going to be honest with you, because I filled out, of course, my bracket challenge. So for those of you who haven't gotten a chance, definitely do that before Monday's games. I actually have Minnesota in the conference final. And part of the reason being is Colorado has really struggled with Minnesota when it comes to that matchup for whatever reason in the past couple of years, and recently in playoff memory too. I had Minnesota in that matchup. I'm wondering if you stick with me on that, or if you feel like Colorado is just too good of a team here. Certainly, there's no secret the Avs are a good team, but injuries and just, the ability that Minnesota might actually hold the goaltending edge for the first time in a while, I think Minnesota might have a chance.
I think they do. And more importantly, here's the thing. I think Minnesota, if they're able to get out of the first round, that itself is a huge morale boost to that squad. That this team, the expectation is to get out of the first round. And if it's anything short of that, it's going to be considered a failure for the season. But like you said, without Landeskog, that hurts. And again, the one thing we forget is over the course of a potentially 7-game season, playoffs are physical. The first round is the most physical round, I think, in the entire Stanley Cup playoffs. So, how does Colorado handle Seattle? And I think, if anything, Seattle will maybe give a footprint a little bit of how you can slow down those guys without Landeskog in the lineup. But let's not forget, too, Colorado's got depth. They're the reigning Stanley Cup champions. They have a lot of the same pieces. We forget guys like Bo and Byram, right? You can all of a sudden fly up the wing and do a power move and tuck one in behind the goaltender. So they've got some talent that can arise on occasion. They were just there. They know what it takes to get there. And at the end of the day, Landeskog hurts, but I think this squad is disciplined enough to where I think they can overcome it. But like you said, Grubauer hasn't been the savior. Now, granted, Darcy Kemper last year wasn't also the savior, but I also feel like Colorado played a much better defensive game last year than they have shown this year. But again, all bets are off. You got to take care of business in front of you first. But if Minnesota does go up against Colorado, as long as you get to Game 7 at the Pepsi Center, it's been pretty good for the Wild in those occasions. So.
Yeah, they might need a guy that's playing, for Winnipeg in that regard, though. With that being said, though, on the other side of this bracket, so Nick, I'm following exactly what I put for my NHL bracket. It's a bit of an off-the-wall bracket compared to what I usually do this year, and I'll admit that freely. Minnesota in the conference final in my type of bracket. Oh, by the way, I guess for statistical purposes, who are you actually picking in this matchup between Colorado and Minnesota? Is there a team that you...
I still feel like Minnesota has the edge here. And I say that not as a homer, but I do feel like as long as they stay healthy, I think that's the big thing. If Eric Sinek can stay on the ice, they have an edge here. I do feel like you said, that over the regular season, they have... just for whatever reason, they've been able to match Colorado. And the one thing that Colorado had as an advantage over a lot of teams last year was their speed, right? That was the one thing that drove a lot of their possession, both exiting the zone and then getting up the ice. And then that offensive, but man, they skate well, right? Minnesota found a way to contain that. They found a way to sort of slow them down a little bit. And I do feel like that there's a bit of a roadmap there for them to get it done. I just feel like, and if it comes down to goaltending, as we discussed, Minnesota has the advantage here, especially with that 1-2 punch beyond Grubauer, where they have Pavel Francouz. He's still a decent goaltender, but you saw last year, like if they don't have to go to him, they probably won't. So it's going to be on the shoulders of Grubauer, and I still think Minnesota has that slight edge.
Yeah, I think Dallas is the scarier matchup out of the 2 rounds, to be totally honest with you. Minnesota, it's going to be tough to get out of that first one, but if they can get out of the first one, I think the roadmap is certainly a possibility. I think Minnesota on the bottom half of this bracket will get Edmonton in the conference final. So Edmonton would take care of both the Los Angeles Kings and then the Vegas Golden Knights, who will have an interesting series against Winnipeg. But I think that Knights team is just too good and too stacked. I think Edmonton gets to the conference final here. Their ability to create offense, their ability to bring that punch. I mean, they're one of the best teams in terms of production. The Stars got to obviously shine, and not the ones in Dallas, if you're talking about the Edmonton Oilers, to handle that Vegas team. But I think they can take care of LA somewhat handily, actually, to be honest with you, in 5 or 6 games. I don't know why. I just have this feeling that Edmonton is going to kind of catch fire in this one. I think Edmonton then beats Vegas to meet Minnesota in the conference final. And I actually have, I kid you not, because this matchup also has favored the Wild in recent, I do have the Minnesota Wild going to their first ever Stanley Cup final in franchise history. Not because we do it on this show, but something about them getting past that Dallas series, I think, will just be a spark plug of monumental proportions. And I think the Edmonton Oilers are going to be the date that gets them there.
Yeah, no, it's and if they're able to shut down McDavid, Draisaitl in that matchup, I mean, all bets are off, right? And with Edmonton, you talk about a goaltending duo that's more suspect. It's the Oilers, right? The thing is, McDavid and Draisaitl, they got this close last year again. Big X factor. We had Evander Kane, who actually had a very productive playoffs last year for the Edmonton Oilers, but had Western Conference Final. I like Minnesota's depth. I do.
Yeah. How do you feel about that bracket on your side of things? Is it still Minnesota, Edmonton, or who's coming out of your bracket here? Vegas and Winnipeg, and Edmonton and LA in the first round.
Edmonton takes care of LA. LA is beat up a little bit. I think the injuries to Fiala and especially their goaltending. I've not been a big fan of their goaltending.
Oh, Fiala's injured? That's a shame.
I know. What a shame, right? So I think Edmonton does take care of LA. Vegas will, I think, handle Winnipeg pretty easily. But here's where it gets interesting, right? Vegas and Edmonton. Here's the thing with Vegas. It looks like they're getting Mark Stone back.
Yeah.
And how about that, right? If they're able to,
how many times have we heard that though?
Called cap, circumvention, at least to the casual fans. So, let's just say this: if he's in the lineup, Vegas takes this. Okay. Mark Stone, honestly, to me, is one of the more underrated two-way playmakers in all of hockey. The thing is, he's been made of essentially stained glass as the last couple of years, which is unfortunate. Thank goodness that Dustin Blufflin doesn't have a lineup on the offensive blue line, because he would be even more pieces. But at the end of it, if Mark Stone isn't back, Edmonton takes this.
Well, let's say for the sake of fun, let's say we're anticipating Mark Stone will be back. Vegas, Minnesota. How do you feel about that matchup?
Not good.
Okay.
Not good.
So Vegas. It seems like, okay.
Yeah. For whatever reason, Vegas this year, despite the essentially just owning that matchup the Wild have had, Vegas is just, with Bruce Cassidy, they found a way to turn that matchup around. And for whatever reason, I can't put my finger on it, but Minnesota just hasn't had the same success this year as they had in years past. Was it like 12-1 before coming into this year? They were just stupid good against Vegas.
Yeah, it's interesting. They were actually the last team to lose in regulation against Vegas. So mighty impressive, besides, of course, Seattle. But in Nick's mind, Vegas in the Stanley Cup final, and Minnesota on my side of things. Interesting matchup over here. Let's start in the top half. We got two more bracket sections to go through, so we'll cruise through them quickly here. Boston, Florida. I think it's no secret who we both have in that one. Yeah, Boston for sure. And then on the other side,
Florida in 4 straight, just like 2019 Tampa, right?
Yeah, certainly. Interestingly enough about the Lightning, Nick, I don't know what your thoughts are. I actually have the Toronto Maple Leafs coming out of this matchup.
Tampa just does not have the same magic in their bottom 6 that they've had in years past. I think Toronto, we said this for 3 or 4 years in a row, that this is their last chance. I think this might actually be their last chance, because if you look at cap friendly, they have like no first or second round picks the next like 2 or 3 years in a row. So if they lose, they have to sell the building. So they put the car keys in the chips in the poker table. I think they have to sell a team back to Harold Ballard. Which gave all Toronto fans nightmares and a half. No, I think Toronto does have this series. Tampa has also not been playing great hockey coming into the playoffs. They kind of limped in. Toronto, I think, is on a mission. I think some of the moves that they made with Ryan O'Reilly, just to name a few of them, have bolstered their lineup about as much as they can. Yeah. Chips are all in, man. I think Toronto does come out of this first round for the first time in quite some time.
Yeah, they've got to, if they can solve Vasilevsky, they're going to be just fine. That's the one issue that they obviously, kind of important. The big cat on the other side of things. And then another netminder they'd have to solve: Boston, Toronto. I'm going off the wall here, Nick. I think Toronto makes the conference final. I think of all the years for Toronto to push to this level would be the year that no one expects them to win that matchup against Boston. I think if they get through that first round against Tampa, I have the Toronto Maple Leafs in the conference final. I told you my board was weird.
I know.
You're like that Boston team is just.
I can't. That's not even just that. But of all the teams that have ended Toronto's season when Toronto had the advantage, it's been the Bruins. It has been Boston. So for it's one of those curious cases. It's like Minnesota Calgary way back, when they first started playing, they could not win at the Saddle Dome for 10, 11, 12 years. They maybe won 3 games over the course of 12 years. It was just like, why, right? It's like that same thing for me with Boston and Toronto in the playoffs. For whatever reason, they just can't solve the Bruins. And the Bruins, to me, how do you stop that train? That's my big thing. I mean, don't get me wrong. Toronto, with all their firepower up front, with Ryan O'Reilly there, again, defensive center. You're talking about a guy like John Tavares, right? So they've tried to address it. Boston's just a well-oiled machine right now. They're so good. They're so lethal up and down the ice with Ullmark also in net. It's hard for me to say the Maple Leafs to come out of this, but I can't say I disagree with the team of destiny argument that you have with the Maple Leafs. They're able to come out of it with the Tampa Bay Lightning. But I don't know. It's going to be hard to stop those Bruins. And the only team that could stop them, to me, Florida Panthers. I'm being serious about that because think about it. Think about it this way. Nobody thought the Tampa Bay Lightning were going to lose a single playoff game coming to the 2019 playoffs and didn't win one game against, of all teams, the Columbus Blue Jackets, right? Who never won a series in their existence until that point.
Yeah, I just don't feel good about the Panthers this year.
I don't either. But that's my thing, right? If there's pressure on any of those teams, it's always in the first round because it's almost like that first couple shifts, right? You get out there, you just want to get involved. I think Boston's there, right? It's not that, they're bad or they're going to falter. It's more of, I think they just need to feel like, okay, yep, we're the clear favorite, or we just set an NHL record for the best regular season in NHL history. They know it's theirs to lose. And sometimes if that creeps in your head a little bit, that's where the door opens up. So it's not that, the Florida Panthers would beat them. That it's just almost like Boston would just beat themselves more than anything.
Yeah. Well, Florida sucks. So in my mind, on the other side though, regardless of Boston or Toronto, I have the New Jersey Devils facing them. They are going to solve the New York Rangers and they are going to solve the Carolina Hurricanes, who are going to best the Isles in that matchup. So in my mind, it's Toronto, New Jersey. Who do you have coming out of those couple of matchups on the bottom half of the bracket? Exact same. Okay. So you've got Boston, New Jersey coming out of this one. That's an interesting matchup that we really don't think we've seen a whole lot actually historically as of late.
Not as of late.
Yeah, partially because the Devils have really struggled. But New Jersey, Boston, could the Devils finally solve the Bruins, or are the Bruins just too good? Here's
the thing. You look at the top end talent on both of those squads, they're pretty equal, right? They're actually match up pretty well. Vitek Vanacek has looked pretty good for New Jersey. Here's the thing, though. Boston's depth and that playoff experience is what may doom the New Jersey Devils. And if there's any one of the stronger teams I think that are most vulnerable, it is the Devils, just because they haven't been there in a long time. Again, the playoffs are just a whole different beast. It'll be the first time for Jack Hughes and a few of the other pieces that are coming in. So if they get there, and I say if, because on paper they should get there, but to me, they're the most vulnerable higher seed in the Eastern Conference just because of their lack of experience. But if they get there, I still take the Bruins. Okay. Where's Zach Parise and Adam Henrique when you need them? So you've got equal $13 million, 13-year, $98 million contracts with the Central Division squad. And then in my bracket here, I have Minnesota and New Jersey matching up for the Stanley Cup final, which I think would be intriguing to say the least. I have the Devils winning this one, 46 total goals in the final here. I think that Devils team just defensively can shut it down as well as Minnesota can, and they bring a good offensive punch. I know Minnesota looked all right in a couple of matchups this year, Matt Boldy in overtime, but I just think the Devils are just too good. I have the Devils capturing the Stanley Cup. You have Vegas and Boston matching up, so I want to know that would be holy buckets. Who wins it, how many games, and how many goals scored in the final series? Because if we're emulating the NHL bracket challenge, you might as well do the whole shebang. Might as well do it. It is Boston. I think they're going to go all the way. Vegas is going to put up a fight. It will be Game 7 at TD Garden. And total goals scored, I'm going to go a little bit higher. I'm going to go 61. Ooh. Okay. Linus Ullmark. We'll see. I know, but that's the thing, right? Is when you've got, we saw this with LA, back in 2012, right? Whereas with the Sharks, sometimes when you have two stout defensive teams, all of a sudden it's like you need to create offense, right? All of a sudden you kind of go off script a little bit. All of a sudden the game opens up and all of a sudden it's like 6-5, 5-4, right? What is this? Pittsburgh, Philly in the early 2010s? I mean, yeah. Or it's more of what, Colorado, Montreal, 11-1 or whatever it was. 1990. No, 2018. That was the game that, it was 2017. And that was when, what was it Markov? Yeah, Andrei Markov hip checked one of the Colorado players and they were up 10-1. It's why? You just upended a player and you clearly don't need to. Like
taking lessons from PK Subban years before, I'm sure. It's interesting though. It's not often that we would say, speaking of off the board, that our brackets will look so different compared to a couple of years ago. The NHL parity has really increased. And I think in the Central Division, I don't think it gets any easier, but the Minnesota Wild will have an interesting task. Dallas, I think, will be one of their most difficult, trying to come out of that first round. It'll be interesting. Of course, Minnesota playing every other day. Basically, they've got Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, of course, will be the first 4 games. And then, of course, you'd have Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday to finish it out if needed. So first 2, of course, in Dallas, next 2 in Minnesota, and then you alternate Dallas, Minnesota, Dallas, should games 5, 6, and 7 be needed. So can't wait to cover it. It'll be exciting. The next time we have our show will be 4 games at least deep. I think our next release, by the way, will likely be coming on Monday, but it might come on Sunday. We'll have to see. So stay tuned for that one. But for sure, the first 3 to 4 games of the series will be complete the next time we join for a full regular episode of the Huskies Warming House podcast. For Nick Maxon, I'm Noah Grant, and we will see you soon in the net.
One-timer, come in, they score! Ripped in! A bomb from Pervix!
So Dana Rasmussen fires and she scores! Dana Rasmussen for the Huskies alongside
Dwayne Kaprizov in for a chance to win it! He scores! Kirill the Thrill is for real! Welcome to the NHL, a game winner!
St. Cloud Cathedral is now 42.6 seconds away from wrapping up the school's first ever title.